It was during COVID-19 pandemic that the phrase global supply chain began to enter casual conversations. As items disappeared from the market shelves, buying a laptop meant waiting for months. Supply chains suddenly came to focus the world over. It was clear things needed to change. But in 2023, how is this great supply chain reset unfolding? Should be the approach to reorient and rewrite global supply chain. Talk on the subject, we have with us today Kinjal Pande, CEO, India and Indian Subcontinent, Schenker, Prahlad Tanwar, partner, KPMG India, Piyush Agarwal, Vice President, Supply Chain, Pepperfry, and Bhavik Mota, Director, Head of Markets Intra, India Subcontinent, Middle East and Africa, AP Moller. Great to have all of you here with us today. So, Kinjal, coming straight to, how would you describe the current global supply chain conditions? You have been in the sector for a long time. Have you seen such changes and this continued state of flux? You talk about sky high demand one day, and then 6 months later, you're worried about the, the sluggish state of consumer demand for merchandise.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree that it is really uncertain. Forecasting is becoming incredibly difficult. And there are various reasons for that, right? Like you very well explained, Pran, in the beginning, coming out of the pandemic, certain governments had given disposable income to people. They were spending a lot more than normal. Manufacturing setups were just flushing out cargo and goods, and it was moving at extremely high rates all over the world. And come, 6 to 8 months ago, when suddenly it's come crashing, right? And as a result of that, the warehouses are full, no one's buying, people are being careful, geopolitical reasons, energy crisis, inflation, financial crisis, all of that. So it has come down. I think many say it's not even normalization, it's a normalization because no one's seen this up and down in demand. Having said that, I think, just looking into the crystal ball, and I'm sure that my friends will also pitch in, there is a slight hope, at least that's what we are reading, that there would be a slight peak. But we have to remember that, the warehouse is also full, where people have not bought it over the last couple of months. So there is a potential that we will not see that high demand or slight hike in demand translate into actual goods moving. But I do know that the governments, if you read up, are doing a lot to increase the disposable income. Yeah, very uncertain.
Right. So, Prahlad, what is your assessment of the current supply chain scenario globally and in India?
Thanks, Pran. So, I think one thing that we're all aware of and agree on is that supply chains are recovering from a period of extended shock, right? And entering a period of uncertainty. Concerns, because obviously supply chains are more than just logistics. We're talking about procurement, we're talking about raw materials, we're talking about sourcing, right? But some of the major concerns, which are impacting supply chains as well as other functions across organizations, are the fact that they're being confronted by recessionary concerns. There's this massive currency risk, right? Where we've seen that 90% of developing countries have seen significant, erosion of their currency value, and 10% of those were more than 30%, right? So we're talking about significant currency issues, we're talking about rapid inflation, right? And we're talking about cash flow issues that organizations have to deal with. Now, obviously, all of these factors will significantly continue to impact supply chain and supply chain planning related decisions, right? But I want to talk about 6 key trends that we have seen in supply chains based on a recent chief procurement officer survey that we did, and there were 6 key very interesting points that came up. The first was geopolitical tensions. Now, obviously, we've been talking about geopolitical tensions for a while, and this is not just limited to what's happening in Europe, but it's also the US's stand on China. It is various other positions that various countries have stated and taken, and there's a view that chief procurement officers have a view that 60% of organizations feel that over the next 3 years, this is going to have a detrimental impact on their supply chain. Right? And this is a major point. We're talking about complete recasting of supply chains, which have been put in place for more than 2-3 decades. Right? I think second, and very interesting, is that material access is in turmoil. And what we mean by that is 70% of the organizations that we spoke to identified raw material cost as the number one supply chain threat for 2023. Right, so we've seen commodity prices skyrocket, and this obviously is causing a lot of issues in terms of sourcing, how much to source, how much inventory to keep going forward. I think third, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is shifting manufacturing footprints. Right, a lot of this is because of input energy costs, geopolitical costs, the raw material costs that I just mentioned, and also supply chain security. Right. Fourth is the fact that we're seeing fundamentally morphing of supply chains. From traditional supply chains to B2B supply chains driven by very different principles and parameters, to supply chains today which are driven by speed to the end customer, right? And that is really driving this whole B2B shift, is driving a fundamental shift in how traditional supply chain managers have operated and how we see them operating in the years to come. And this is also going to be a transitionary phase, because obviously we're going to go through a bit of a challenging period as you break down earlier supply chain principles and start introducing more of these, speed-based principles, right? I think fifth is the technology investments. We're seeing a lot of new technology. Up to 2023, I would say that a lot of technology investments that we saw in companies was mainly at the back end, and it was also in customer experience areas, right? But we're seeing now from 2023, early 2023, that a lot of the technology investments actually focus on supply chain and operations. So that is also going to recast the way some of these supply chains have operated. And I think finally, and very important for supply chain and logistics particularly, is going to be this whole increased scrutiny on scope 3 emissions, right? So this is going to be a major factor, whether it is regulators, whether it is the communities, whether it's the customer. I think just the environmental impact is going to be a major focus point for supply chains, which historically has not really been a major area of focus. Coming to India, Pran, I think India is obviously much better placed, right, for a few reasons. One is that a lot of the global supply chains, India's contribution to global trade is about 2.5%, right, to start off. And I think we're well poised now where this percentage is going to increase. So we're at that point where we can actually implement some of these changes, which many other nations have to actually fundamentally change, right? So I think we're well placed. I think there's massive emphasis on manufacturing, the various policies and schemes, whether it's the PLI, whether it's various other schemes and incentives that the government is creating. And I think also the fact that there's a lot of thrust on infrastructure combined with the geopolitical stability. I think supply chains in and around India, we are well placed to take advantage of the next 5-10 years.
So Piyush, we can come to after the chaotic period, have supply chains eased for you? And Prahlad talked about raw material costs and shifting manufacturing footprints. What is it that you guys are seeing?
Yeah, last 2-3 years has been quite chaotic, as you mentioned. But I would say definitely the supply chain has eased off. There are many aspects to look at it, right? One thing is the uncertainty. Uncertainty was pretty high in the last 2-3 years, which has definitely reduced by a very good level now. So that is one thing. Uncertainty is down. The second is the cost part. So if we break the cost part into three parts, one is the raw material cost, and it depends on business to business, right? Commodity prices are high, but the kind of business in which we are in, which involves furniture, the pricing has not gone that steep high as compared to the commodity prices. But when it comes to the freight cost and all, and especially the imported containers and all, the easing off is there. As I guess Kinjal also mentioned that the rates have come down to the pre-COVID levels. So the freight costs are low as compared to the COVID level. It has skyrocketed in that phase. The third part is on the government policies. I think there is some relief when it comes to government policies and the way things are being looked upon when it comes to logistics and supply chain. So many new initiatives are there, many new things are coming. So that's something I guess is going to further ease off the supply chain pressures to a good extent. But when it comes to pressure, when it comes to business, then I believe it's a different scenario altogether. I guess demands were pretty high during the COVID period for certain industries. People forecasted a much higher number from what actually turned out to be the actual number in the current trend. And I do see that it's a 5 to 6 months kind of scenario where things will start improving after, like, say, September onwards, things will start improving. But these all are business scenarios. From a supply chain point of view, things are much better now as compared to 2 years back.
So, Bhavik, if I can come to Piyush, as a business, things might look up in the next 5 to 6 months. But what are you seeing when it comes to global economic slowdown, and what is the kind of impact that is having on your industry?
First of all, Pran, thank you very much for having me over. I think it's good to be discussing about supply chain and with friends that from the industry. So thank you very much for that. With regards to the question, of course, the global economics slowdown, as you said, is definitely having a significant impact on the logistics industry. And if you also look at the data point, right, the growth rate, the global trade growth is expected to be less than 2% this year compared to what we have seen around 5% last couple of years, right? Let's not forget, with monetary tightening, fading fiscal support, stimulus, and also, of course, the service sector reopening are now weighing on the global goods demand, which, of course, left extraordinarily during the pandemic. Supply chain bottlenecks are no longer a key constraint on the trade flows. And the recent impact that we are seeing is more a reflection of absolutely slowing demand. To put it simply, in a period of economic slowdown, international trade, which is both exports and imports, falls sharply as overall demands for goods and services stand reduced. What we are seeing is also an aversion of discretionary spending. And it is in this light, I feel, the exports of engineering goods, chemicals, retail, ready-made garments to be specific, plastics, petrochem, so on and so forth, are either contracting or are growing at a much slower pace in 2023. The impact of this for us, from an industry perspective, what we are seeing is, of course, the reduced demand for these goods. So the consumers are buying less, which is leading to lower demand. And this is putting a downward pressure also on the freight rates and causing some logistics company also to reduce capacity. What we're also seeing a trend is, while the demand is going down, the freight rates are under pressure. We are seeing increase in the cost of fuel, labor, every other input cost is rising, which is also increasing the cost of logistics services. And as a result of this, it's making it more difficult for logistics companies to maintain profitability. From a customer perspective, the global supply chains are becoming a lot more complex in the last recent years, as both because of the outcome of pandemic, which have accelerated a lot of the transformation. Businesses have sought to outsource production, in many cases finding new markets, given the softness in demand in many markets, many changes in the market also due to the geopolitical tension, as many alluded to. This complexity is making it more difficult to manage the logistics operation, requiring a lot more flexibility and agility and speed of decision making. So we are seeing a massive change in the way the customers are viewing logistics also. And from our peers, which I mean is competition, the industry is also becoming extremely competitive. Many new digital savvy players are entering in the market. The existing players like us are expanding their operations, and this is putting a downward pressure on prices, making it more difficult for the companies to differentiate themselves from their competition. So in general, it's also putting a lot of pressure in order to be truly integrated and truly customer centric, and to be able to be a cost leader in this. So from long story short, I think we expect this slowdown to continue, as you said, for the next few months. And the way we see it, the logistics companies that can adapt to these changing market conditions and the demand will emerge as the most successful in a period of challenging macro outlook and new types of uncertainties for our customers. I think the ones who are determined to speed up their business transformation and increase their or improve their operation excellence, I think we'll have many more opportunities to deal with this scenario much better and serve the customers much better in these uncertain times.
We touched on few of the factors which are at play here, but if you want to expand on this, what are the different types of factors currently at play when it comes to global supply chain?
Sure, I think a lot has been said, but I have the pleasure of summarizing it, maybe adding a few more points. But Bhavik alluded to discretionary spending, disposable income. I think a lot of factors, one of the factors, key factors that will influence demand is what governments, especially in Europe and US, do in the now to increase the disposable income. And there's a lot that is happening, but we don't know to what extent, because it also depends on consumer sentiment and how much they want to kind of spend on goods versus experiences. Because what we've seen also over the last 6-8 months is that the typical consumer today, in whatever disposable income that they have, want to spend on experiences, going to that holiday they missed, or their favorite restaurant, instead of actually buying merchandise or goods, right? So this is a key factor that will determine demand. And on the supply side, I think how demand goes one of the factors that is playing is how efficiently the importers today are able to free up space in their warehouses. Because for logistics specialists like us, it's important that the goods move to support the customer. But if the warehouses are full because of overstocking that has happened over the last couple of months and nobody buying, the goods will actually not move, right? So, and that will impact manufacturing and so on and so forth. So I think that is also another important factor. And many alluded to just having a very resilient and agile supply chain. So, this will pan out over a period of time because it doesn't happen overnight. Adopting technology, whether it's near-shoring or whether it is increasing your supplier base, to make it more resilient, more agile. All of these things play out over a period of time. So I don't think it'll have much of an impact or very limited impact over the course of 2023. And in all of this, God forbid, but if there's another disruption that is added, I think we are back to square one, right? And that is always unpredictable.
Weather or a Suez Canal?
Yeah, I mean, we sometimes tend to rule out climatic changes, right? I mean, if the Panama Canal suddenly has water shortage, we will again go back to square one in terms of vessels bunching up, containers not being there at the right time, sudden spurt in prices. Bhavik talked about costs and goods not reaching on time, then, the potential overstocking and what have you, right? It's a vicious cycle. So there are a lot of factors at play, but disruptions aside, I think it's important that the disposable income increases, and we will see the proof of that probably over the next coming months. Let's see if there's a peak.
So Prahlad, I was going through your LinkedIn profile, and in one of your posts, you talked about your recent trip, 8 cities in Europe and Asia to meet and discuss, the state of logistics industry. And you had mentioned that, there are decades when nothing happens and years when decades happen. What did you mean?
Thank you. Thanks, Pran. Thanks for the question and, for the reference to that post. I think a couple of things, right? As we're hearing from Bhavik and Kinjal, who run large organizations, we're talking about how the current situation is back to how it was pre-pandemic, right? Where we're seeing a lot of softening demand, we're seeing pressure on margins. But I think what has happened is that the transport and logistics community sector specifically, right, within the wider supply chain sphere, has witnessed a very interesting phase that started at the beginning of the pandemic and continued till a few months ago, right? And I think just to kind of put it in context, starting 2008 all the way up to about 2020, was a very challenging phase for many segments within the transport logistics sector, right? And there were many reasons for that. One was the fact that in certain segments of the logistics industry, there was a phenomenon of significant overcapacity, right? Where orders were placed, and as a result, a lot of these mega vessels and carriers and capacity came on board. And unfortunately, at the same time, we saw global, demand softening, right, which created clearly a situation which again put pressure on margins because you had a lot of space and not enough takers for that space. And this continued off and on for well over a decade, right? And of course, there were a few bright spots, but what it did do is that it kind of plunged the logistics sector specifically into a phase that lasted for about 13 years, which was extremely challenging. But then, come the pandemic, and this is, as I say, right, fact is stranger than fiction. No one could have designed this. I think what happened is there was significant disruption in supply chains, and for the simple reasons that the same situation of overcapacity very quickly moved to a situation where you now had constrained capacity, right? So especially organizations that either owned infrastructure and capacity or had access to infrastructure and capacity was really able to kind of bounce back, right? They were in a situation to kind of in a very privileged situation to service customers that had significant kind of bottlenecks in terms of getting supply of capacity. And what they really did is, in the last 2.5 years, we saw that most of these organizations, I'm talking about any of the large organizations, right, irrespective of which part of the world they're in, but all the top players particularly, right, recorded their best years ever. And I'm talking about, companies in many cases which have been around for more than a century, registered their best years in terms of profitability and, in terms of growth, particularly from a revenue point of view, not necessarily from a volumetric point of view. And I think what we saw is that in these 3 years, we've seen a significant pivot by many large players, right? So we've seen significant inorganic acquisition. We've seen companies experimenting with some very exciting technologies. We've seen a lot of emphasis on investing in the future, particularly in the environment and ESG aspects. But I think most critical has been that a lot of these mega players, right, have essentially looked to readdress their core value proposition. So, what they were before is what they're trying to make sure that they're not necessarily only that in the future. And I think that calls for a significant transformation. And hence, my statement where there are decades where nothing can happen, but there are years when, decades can happen.
Piyush, what are the lessons that you have learned as an organization over the last few years when it comes to supply chain?
Yeah. So as an organization, I guess when it comes to e-commerce and a company like Pepperfry, supply chain is one of the pillars of the company. Okay. We believe that supply chain for a company like Pepperfry is one of the USPs of the company, where many other companies are not able to achieve this kind of supply chain, and they lose out on competition in this regard. So the key lesson in terms of supply chain, maybe I will limit it to two. The first one will be that in terms of the resilient supply chain, you should strike a balance when it comes to how much you want to control the supply chain and how much you want to depend on the third parties. Okay, so in my experience and in the experience of the company, there are certain things which we directly control, and there are certain things which we are dependent on the third parties. And the third parties also should be good collaborative partners. But that's a different discussion. But the point being that you don't want to outsource a few of the critical things which you believe that are very important for your business, and you want full control on these things. And so in our case, distribution is one such thing which we have never outsourced. We are handling the distribution 100% by ourselves. The second part is that when it comes to customer experience for a company like a D2C company, supply chain can play a very, very critical role in customer experience. Because if you look at our business, a delivery person goes to the customer. He is interacting with the customer for around 30 minutes doing the delivery, because it's a furniture delivery, doesn't happen in 1 minute. And then a carpenter or a assembly guy goes to the customer, meeting him, interacting with him for another 1 hour or something. So the kind of impact the supply chain team can create on customer retention and repeat buys is very high. So it's not a support function in that sense. It's a function which drives the sale or the repeat sale or a good customer experience. So you have to be very, very good in that part. You cannot say that delivery is done and assembly is done and my work is done. If the delivery was done in a good manner, the product was good, assembly was good, but the customer interaction was not good, the customer was not happy with the interaction part, then also it's a loss of the customer. So how tightly you manage the customer satisfaction in this space, the D2C space, uh, is very much dependent on supply chain, and you should be very much in control of that thing.
Very, very interesting, Piyush. Bhavik, do you think supply chains at the moment can still be characterized by considerable uncertainty and the lack of reliability? And the second part of that question would be, if something like a pandemic happens again, do you think the industry will be able to respond better?
Good question, Pran. To be very honest, I'm a bit torn on this one. It is. I personally feel it's unlikely that global supply chains will ever become perfect or reliable in the immediate future or ever, right? Even before the pandemic, I never thought that it was always reliable, right? So there will always be some level of uncertainty, risk associated with global trades, right? Climate related, geopolitical related, demand related, what have you, right? So I don't think we'll ever have that. So on one hand, I feel that with the learnings from 2020 to 2022 period, logistics industry is likely to respond in a much better manner. On the other hand, I feel all these things that we talk about, near sourcing, China plus one, reduction of lead times, etc., right, would allow the industry to react better, but not as much as may have happened as we would have envisaged in terms of the traction on these items. And classic example, and Piyush can verify that, right? A year back in supply chain discussions was the top agenda, in the boardroom, and that was a joke saying, we were the ones who were always the support function. Now the logistics is becoming part of the boardroom discussions, which I feel personally right now, based on the discussions we are having with the customers, has lost flavor to other business challenges. It's not ignored, just lost a bit of steam, I feel. And it's the logistics team in those companies who have been tasked with the KPIs, like reduction on lead times, reliability, flexibility in supply chain, sustainability, amongst others. However, if you ask my personal view, I have a couple of reasons that makes me feel confident that the global logistics industry will put up a much better show in case of any future shocks. Hopefully not, but similar to pandemic that might arise, right? One of the reason is the diversified supply chain. Most sourcing organization that face shocks of COVID pandemic have diversified the supply chain beyond China by sourcing goods from multiple origins like India, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, what have you, right? This will help reduce the risk of disruption because it's quite diversified. Second, as a logistics company, I think we have all invested in long-term relationships. Shippers, consignees, as well as the logistics firms that look to build resilient supply chain are building stronger relationship with their supply chain partners to come together and mitigate the risk and respond to the disruption much better. This includes, with customers, the long-term trend contracting, with vendors, it's vendor rating, dashboarding, continuous evaluation of logistics cost, efficiency, as well as effectiveness. So there's a lot of investments been done to understand each other's territory, double clicking on what everybody brings on the table, and really kind of unearthing what it means to us. Third is, I think, is the investment in technology. I think logistics company, as well as all the big customers, have invested considerably in technology, and especially in the last 3-4 years, to improve efficiency and, of course, reduce cost. This will make the global supply chain more resilient to shocks. Many companies have come up with their own supply chain management platforms that improves transparency across their and the customer supply chain. We have also come up with a lot of platforms which help those customers. So I'm seeing a lot of technology advancement, which is bringing that visibility, bringing that predictability, and the need for flexibility, if at all, in the supply chain. And last but not the least, I feel there is an increasing demand from most of our global customers for a high level of transparency when we manage the supply chain. This helps them to identify risks and develop contingency plans. The Maersk control tower, like we have, has been very popular since its inception, as it offers the end-to-end real-time visibility to our customers on the cargo and the alerts what is needed. So all of these investments, reflections, learnings from the last couple of years, I think collectively as an industry, we will be a much, much better place to respond to any shock, if at all, that might come in the near future. That's my take on this.
Right.
That's my
Kinjal,
take on this.
ever since the pandemic, we've talked about strengthening supply, making it more resilient. How successful have we been, and are global supply chains still fragile?
A lot of work has been done, but I think we're still fragile because many of these changes, like I mentioned earlier, are also not overnight, right? So very much like has been mentioned, Prahlad mentioned, even Bhavik and Piyush, technology is something which will always be a long-term investment, right? And the uptake on technology and digitalization has just been phenomenal. What previously used to be a conversation in terms of should we put in investment in this platform, let's speak to our service providers, there's a cost attached to it, and let's park it for like another year, and then so on and so forth. The decision making around adopting technology and investing has been really, really good. And we see that everywhere when we speak to our customers, where there's also now a sort of service providers such as ourselves, we are able to kind of push technology out given the requirements. So it's not a pull strategy anymore, and then the uptake on the customer side is a lot better. Second, of course, I think I also would like to add that even on the supply side, service providers, especially asset owning companies, they've also become very fast and agile in terms of managing supply to changing demand situation. Earlier, we spoke about how the demand has just been going up and down dramatically, bringing in a lot of uncertainty in terms of how we forecast. But I think whether it's the airline industry, whether it's shipping lines in terms of blank sailings, whatever it takes to kind of curtail supply to meet the demand is a lot faster than what it used to be 5 years ago or a decade ago. And I think that also helps to kind of keep the, to kind of maintain the balance. Otherwise, typically we know that, there's a threshold. If the costs increase up to a certain point, or if the costs dip below a certain point, it can again cause a disruption and skew the balance, where we will again go into this supply issues, right? So I think it always helps to kind of be agile in creating that balance. And then lastly, I think we definitely, when we speak to our customers at Schenker, when we speak to specifically our automotive, electronics customers, even retail, we are actually seeing it in practice where we are seeing nearshoring. And we are seeing that customers want to source from various markets and not just one country, for example, right? I mean, I remember when I was in Myanmar, and just one day of a geopolitical issue can cause disruption in supply chains, where suddenly retail customers who were sourcing primarily from that country, I've had to kind of run overnight and kind of look at alternate markets, right? That decision is coming in a lot faster. And over the last years, we have seen, last 2 years specifically, we have seen that, they are diversifying their sourcing markets. And this will continue. Bhavik already touched upon that point on supplier partnerships. And I think that is key, because from moving from a very transactional, cost-based partnership to something which is more strategic, we are definitely seeing that, where the conversations have changed. Conversations have changed about, let's just say, let's invest in EV vehicles. Now, EV vehicles cannot be a 6-month contract. It's an investment. And the conversations have changed when we say, let's look 5 years down the line and see how we want to kind of partner on this and do an investment jointly, right? So these are some of the key things that have happened, but it's definitely improved. It's definitely become more resilient. We are more resilient, more agile, but some way to go.
Prahlad, Kinjal says she sees examples of aspects like diversification, friendshoring. There was one study which says that 40% of the 30 trillion worth of goods traded each year originate from 3 or fewer nations. How much of diversification, friendshoring, etc., do you think is actually happening? How much of it is hype? How much of it is substance?
Right. Thanks, Pranay. This is obviously an interesting point. It's been a raging topic of discussion for some time now. further enhanced by the recent pandemic and the disruptions. So interestingly, my view is that fundamentally supply chains, and I'm talking about global supply chains, right, don't like exceptions, right? Historically, good supply chains are institutionalized so that uh, the opportunity of any exception is minimized, right? And this is historically, all of us who come from the industry, you will see that the whole point of an efficient supply chain is the number of exceptions are constantly reducing, right? However, I think one of the narratives that has become very popular is this whole thing about dynamic supply chains and flexible supply chains and resilient supply chains. The reality is you don't want a supply chain to be very flexible. You want it to be scientific, right? And scientific is based on certain principles. And if you go back again 2-3 decades, a lot of global corporations, right, particularly in North America and the United States and in Europe, developed these supply chains gradually over years, right? Till they became essentially like roadways between Asia, going to the West, right? And for years they perfected it. It became a science where year after year there was Lean, there was Six Sigma, there was principles like JIT, Kanban. All of these were developed on supply chains not really being flexible, and in not being flexible, creating maximum value for all the stakeholders involved, right? That's how you were able to establish prices. You were able to keep commodity prices, raw material input costs, balance it out, hedge futures, so on and so forth, right? Now, to the point of, are we seeing these shifts, right? Are we seeing nearshoring? Are we seeing friendshoring? The fact is the world has changed, Pran, over the last 2 decades, right? And I think the reality is also there are some fundamentals we need to understand of the global economy. It's interesting, but 47 of the global GDP today is controlled by 3 nations, right? North America, specifically the United States, China, and Japan. If you add the entire European Union, then you add about 15% to that. So what we're essentially saying is, close to 65, almost 70% of the global GDP is controlled by these 3 countries and, Western Europe. Now, the reason this is important to look at is, and to put that in context, India's share in the global GDP is about 3.2%, right? So when we talk about now recasting supply chains, the focus is really on de-risking these supply chains that organizations and regulators have built over 2-3 decades. And how do you hedge your manufacturing risk? How do you, safeguard your sourcing dependencies? So I think there's clearly a move towards ensuring that there are alternative bases in place. Because it's not just the pandemic, it's not just a volcano. It's like we discussed earlier, geopolitical fundamentals are shifting, right? And I think that is a very, very important point, which is going to drive where companies source from, how they source, who are their partners, how they go about it. I think another important, so I'll just pause there and just underline the point that yes, I don't think it is hype. I think it is something that is happening. It is very difficult, however, because of the reason that I mentioned, the fact that all of this is a work in process. There's a lot of scouting. Kinjal mentioned in Myanmar, we have seen a lot of evidence in Vietnam. We have seen a lot of evidence in Mexico. However, there are some fundamental issues, right? And I'll just to give you a sense of what those fundamental issues are, particularly during the pandemic years, we estimate that approximately 17 trillion of value was lost, right? That was the cost of the global pandemic. And that is approximately 20% of the world's income over the last 2 years. Now, who was impacted by this loss? Interestingly, 60% of the low-income countries and 30% of emerging economies are today in near debt or in distress, right? So when you talk about investing in creating new infrastructure, creating new manufacturing capability, we have to balance out the reality that the pandemic is not just rosy for other countries. They've also taken a major toll, right? I mentioned earlier how we've seen 19 developing countries that have seen currency weaken, right? Most of them significantly. So these are all issues which are, I would say, slowing the process down, but we're definitely seeing the shift. And I think, in my view, will take at least 2, 3, 4 more years for us to really start seeing the evidence. But we are seeing the FDIs come in. We are seeing commitments by large organizations to kind of pledge to set up manufacturing and sourcing capabilities in different countries. So the shift is happening.
Piyush, from what you observe, are regional supply chains more resilient than maybe global players? Do smaller regional players have a better chance at performing consistently?
Yeah. So Pran, so the industry from where I come from, I have a background with Colgate and Pepperfry. So it's a very operation heavy industry, FMCG and e-commerce. And I don't see a reason that why regional players cannot compete with the global players. I believe they have a very, very good chance in doing that. Because what global players bring in terms of competency is the systems, the processes they bring in along with them. But the real supply chain, according to me, happens on the shop floor. Uh, I believe that if you are able to control the shop floor well, while you require process, you require system, you require technology for that. So, but the control on the shop floor, how well you know uh, the work area, how much you know, you are aware about what you are doing and the work, that is very, very critical. So, taking a very extreme example that a global player uh, who is very good at systems, processes, uh, but not so good at handling the local people, the managing the local people who are running the show, will never be able to do well uh, as compared to a regional player who is very good in managing the people. So I don't see why they cannot compete. I guess it's a very fair chance they also have. Uh, and In the last 2 3 years, I guess all the regional players also they have started adopting the technology part of it. They are not very far behind when it comes to technology. So I believe the global players are good; they are doing good. But uh, the real game is that who manages the operations part in a much better way. Uh, I guess that's the critical point. Whichever player has a good control on the operations is a better player in terms of is a better player for a company like Pepper.
Kinjal, I think this will be the last round of questions for everyone. So, starting with you, there are recent reports that containers are piling up at ports now. What is your assessment? How do you see container availability for the rest of the year and yeah, shipping rates headed?
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to hear Bhavik's uh, comments on these as well. But from what we see and what we hear is that, of course, as Piyush also mentioned, as a customer, he's seeing that the congestion is easing out. So it's not how it was a couple of years ago where containers were scarce. They were stuck somewhere and it took time for it to get to where it was needed. And by the time it reaches, the demand is over. And then, so we had those kind of problems, right? So we feel that, of course, compared to what we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years, it's definitely eased up. How the containers move again is very much dependent on so many factors, like we discussed. How's the demand moving? There are no disruptions. It's not getting stuck somewhere. There are no strikes anywhere. The ports are functioning well in terms of productivity and so on and so forth, right? So it's all connected. The supply chains are all connected. So even if one part of the whole chain stops working, I mean, suddenly if India says they don't need newsprint, we will have 40 high cube shortages, which means that if retail customers want to export something out, they will not find the 40 high cubes on time. So it's very interconnected, but, I would just like to say that's gotten a lot better. In terms of shipping rates, yes, it's definitely normalized. I mean, Piyush also mentioned that it's, down to pre-COVID levels. Having said that, and I'm sure everybody will join in what I'm trying to say is that, there is a threshold. And it's not good for anybody, whether it's from the logistics industry side or it's from the customer side and the end consumer side, that beyond a certain threshold, the rates fall, because it would typically mean that there are unfortunate exits from the market, which would mean that it adds unnecessary pressure and unprecedented pressure in supply. We have seen that over the last 15 years happening. There's certain critical years where there have been exits, causing tremendous pressure on supply, and again causing the same issues of increase in the final goods that are being sold, and ultimately putting pressure on consumers like you and me. So I think while the rates have normalized, it's very, very important that it sort of normalizes to a point and doesn't go beyond a certain threshold level. Because certainly, as we've heard, the demand is not going to pick up to a point where supply would get normalized.
Bhavik,
You want to add something?
The wrong time to answer when you have customers like Pepperfry, Piyush on the call and Kinjal on the call on what the freight levels would be. But jokes apart, I think Kinjal covered it very well, right? I think let's call spade a spade. Of course, during pandemic, everybody inflated a lot of new containers or leased a lot of new containers, and combination of two reasons. One was of course the unprecedented demand that we saw compared to slowdown that was expected, and second was given all the operational challenges and COVID restrictions around the world and congestion and what had you, a lot of containers were stuck in storage. And there was a point data which suggested that 53% of the global fleet was not moving, but just storing the goods at that point of time, right? That means that 53% of the containers were not being able to use, and which meant if you had to meet the requirement of the customers and the demand that was there, everybody had no option but to manufacture a lot more new containers. And on average, give or take, every company basically manufactured close to 15% extra inventory in the last 2 years. Now, with all the supply chain issues easing out, combined with the slowdown in the demand that we have, I don't see a foreseeable challenge on the availability of equipment per se, which also means that the lines and the shipping lines who have invested a lot, it's also a time for housekeeping. So what we are doing as we speak is scrapping a lot of old containers, trying to close down the lease that we had with many of the leasing companies and so on and so forth. So those operational efficiencies to reduce your cost and also kind of do your housekeeping that is needed, maintenance that is needed, is taking full-fledged. But personally, I don't foresee container shortage as Kinjal mentioned in the times to come. At least in the next 6 to 8 months till we start seeing demand again picking up to the levels that we expect it to be, and we are pretty optimistic on that front, that come Q3 of this year, around August, based on all the forecasts that we have from our big retailers in Bangladesh and India, I think at least there is a bit of optimism, but we do expect the demand to start improving. But we still don't have an issue where we will start scrambling for containers per se.
Prahlad, I have looked at supply chain since the pandemic, and one thing is clear that there's always something wrong. In that sense, have supply chain strategies kept pace? Will strategies like resilience, stockpiling, diversification, network optimization work? I mean, most of these have been around since 1990, and it certainly did not work, during the pandemic. Does it give you confidence that it will work the next time around?
Right. Thanks, Pran. I think, firstly, the pandemic, particularly, and I want to highlight this, was a very specific disruption, right? And, obviously, disruptions are aspects, all black swan events that you can create, 5 or 6 scenarios, and this is probably the 25th scenario, right, which you never even got to. I think the reality is that supply chain today are mature, right? And it goes back to the point that supply chains have been around for a while. They have kind of gone through, a few meetings. They've gone through a few learnings, things, like you said, there are a lot of tactical measures, right? Optimization of network. In fact, Bhavik just spoke about how just 12 months ago they were running up to get additional containers leased. Today they have to backtrack on that, right? These are all tactical moves that businesses have to take, right? Because at the end of the day, supply chains are serving organizations and serving customers. And I think, as long as, you're trying to do that in an environment where the goalpost is constantly shifting, you have to constantly try different strategies. You have to try different tactical measures. And in my view, yes, absolutely. They will continue. There will continue to be different measures that supply chain and supply chain managers across the world need to take. There'll be a lot of trial and error. But I think as a community and as an industry, it'll just make us stronger and better at managing exceptions.
Right. Piyush, we all, we've all been talking about supply chain agility, reliance. Can you give some examples of, how Pepperfry is ensuring this?
Yeah. So And I would say that driving agility, resilience is definitely a long-term strategy for any company. It's not built in like 4 or 5 months kind of period, but pointing out 2 3 major initiatives which we are driving from years, and I guess COVID has accelerated that part. One is on the merchant base. If you look at the our vendor base or the merchant base, so we are a marketplace. We don't manufacture anything on our own, right? So we are very much dependent on the merchant base, and we have been developing the merchant base from the last 10 years, and like filtering out the merchant base, bringing new merchants, developing their capability, going into their factories, understanding their manufacturing, they become more efficient, and Pepperfry becomes a major partner for them, right? So that is one of the strategies, so that the sourcing ever stops. The product keep on coming, and the merchant count is also very high. It's not that we are dependent on 10 or 20 merchants. The merchant count is like around 1,000 or something. So it's a good number of merchant base from where we are sourcing the material. The second part is in terms of the distribution part of it, or how we are serving our customers. So in that part, as I mentioned earlier, we have kept we have made a very strong team, and that team is driving the distribution in house. So if you look at so we are not a asset light company in that sense. Like most of the e-commerce companies, they talk about being asset light and all. We are also asset light for certain aspects, but for certain aspects of distribution. So all the last mile vehicles are our own vehicles. Warehousing we manage on our own. Uh, so all the racking and everything in the warehouses is our own racking, and the vehicles are our own. The teams who are going for distribution and the delivery of the goods are our own teams. We are not dependent on the third parties for that. We are dependent on the third parties for many other things, but not for this. So uh, the kind of control you have on your own assets is much higher, definitely. Uh, if anything happens, so you're 100%. You can give your 100% to your company in from those assets, right? So that's in terms of the resilience, I guess. 2 3 things which we have been driving from the last 10 years or 5 6 years, and these are not new strategies. We have been doing this before pandemic also. What pandemic did? Pandemic told us to explore things in terms of technology, how technology can help solve some of the problems which we faced during pandemic. So we have invested in technology in solving some of those problems, in becoming more and more resilient.
Right. Bhavik, I will let you have the last word. The question being that, sustainability, going green, I think those are the buzzwords now. And emissions from paying has faced increasing regulatory and consumer scrutiny. What are the more specific action that's taking place, especially regarding going green in the shipping business?
A good question. And as you know, yesterday also we celebrated the World Environment Day, right? So at Maersk, since it's specific to Maersk, I think we take our responsibility towards environment very seriously. And to understand what it means, you have to understand our business model, right? I mean, if you see, it's mainly into 3 areas. For us, it's the ocean transportation, then you have the logistics and services, and then you have the ports and terminal business, right? And these have 3 enablers, which is ESG, technology, and people. And if you look at our articles or our purpose and mission and all of that, ESG is core to our purpose. It is integral part of the business strategy and a prerequisite for us to be successful as a global integrator. If you look at shipping itself, it contributes to close to 3% of the total global emissions that you have. So in 2018, if you remember, Maersk took a position with a strong commitment to decarbonize the entire shipping operation by 2050. And of course, develop scalable solutions to help the entire industry reduce the greenhouse gas footprint. Since then, of course, a lot of actions have happened to accelerate that to the extent with the success that we had in the last 3 4 years. In 2022 of January last year, we moved our pledge to fully decarbonize our operation a decade forward. So from 2050, now the commitment is to decarbonize completely by 2040. The beauty is that the customers that we deal with, the 2/3 of the top 200 customers that we have also set zero or science-based decarbonization targets for themselves. And they rely on us to achieve their emission targets. So we also have customers in that partnership to be able to achieve those emissions, and is also helping us propel in a lot of the discussion. In this year itself, 2023, we will have the first container ship operating on green methanol using a dual engine technology, and very low sulfur, followed by 18 large ocean-going container vessels in the year after, and the next year, the year after. So 24 and 25, we'll have 18 more ships which will run on green methanol. So all of these very, very specific actions supported by the top 200 customers who matter to us. I think it's an unavoidable thing. It is something that should be part of this thing. Of course, the big question is the cost, which will be, of course, very significant in the short term. But we also seen the cost difference between bunker and the green fuel reducing in the past 1 year. So we are hopeful that over a period of time, when the scale comes in, the efficiency comes in, the cost will basically take us a backseat. And green shipping will also become a big differentiator amongst customers towards their end consumers, and especially more and more with the end consumers in US and North America, and even in India, right? And I'm sure the next generation is all for sustainable products and stuff. So that trend is only going to go up. So the faster you embark on that journey and commit yourself to that journey, you will be well recognized, and rightfully so. We all owe that much to our planet, and I think as much we are very much committed to that.
Right. I think we're completely out of time. Disruptions to supply chain are set to stay, whether they are the existing ones or new ones. For all stakeholders, risk management probably will be the key. Thank you, Kinjal, Bhavik, Prahlad, and Piyush for joining us today. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you.